Today we'll discuss on arrow function which is added in ES6 in 2016. An arrow function is similar to a function expression, but it has a shorter syntax in comparison to function expression. We'll take a look at the advantages of arrow function and also we'll go through the list where we are not supposed to use arrow function. This is the syntax of an arrow function. It has the parameters which needs to be passed into the parentheses, a fat arrow, which is why this function is called arrow function, and the curly brackets where the code goes. If you see this syntax, it's very small and sweet. It doesn't have the function keyword. This is one of the features of arrow function. The final look of the arrow function looks as follows. We have the function wherein we are passing two parameters a comma b and returning the sum of it. It's stored in a variable num. If we need to call it, we need to call it using num and passing the arguments to it. If we just have one statement in this function, we can write it in one line. So we can get rid of the curly brackets and the return statement. This is called as implicit return. Arrow function takes care of returning the value and it doesn't need curly brackets and the return statement. If it has more than one statement, then you need to explicitly return the value. Parentheses are optional in arrow function if it just has one parameter. So as shown here, a, arrow and code here. If it has more than one, then it needs to be having in the parentheses. If it doesn't have any parameter, it needs to have the empty parentheses. To call an arrow function explicitly, you need to assign it to a variable as shown. Making call to add numbers of arrow numbers is shown as over there. To self-invoke, we need to put the full entire arrow function inside the parenthesis and call it. These are the benefits of arrow function. We are getting rid of function keyword, making the function look small and sweet. We have implicit return feature, also the lexical binding of this inside arrow function. Arrow function can be used inside event listeners, inside timing function, that is set timeout, set interval. It can be also used for sorting, mapping inside an array. It can be also used with promises. When not to use an arrow function, don't use arrow function for a constructor. JavaScript throws an error for the same. Even when we have an event to be added to a button and we try to use this keyword inside this, making use of arrow function, it refers to a window and it will not work on the button. So be careful whenever you're using arrow function, use it in the right place and use it for the right purpose. Let's run through some example in JSPW how to call an arrow function. We'll see first the normal function expression. We'll convert that into an arrow function and we'll run through it. We'll see how to use implicit return, how to use arrow function on arrays, how to use the this keyword. We'll compare it with the old way and the new arrow function way, how arrow function benefits for it. Also we'll see how to self-invoke a arrow function, how to pass object literal in an arrow function. I'll type the function here. So this is a normal function expression. It takes two arguments a comma b and returns the sum of it. So we are calling it and passing 10 comma 20 and alerting the value. So let's run this. It gives the value as 30. Let's convert this function expression into arrow function. So first thing, we are getting rid of the function keyword. We are adding an arrow over here. That's it, and we are done, and this is our arrow function. Let's run this and we get the value as 30. Now if you see, we just have one statement in this, so we can get rid of this curly brackets and the return statement and just goes in one line. So this is called as implicit return. If you have multiple statements, you need to explicitly return the value to the function. Now when we run this, we get the value as 30. How to use arrow function on an array? So I have this array defined here. Let's first add the numbers and sort it. This is how the old way would have looked like. It gives me the value as 40 because it added 10, 20 and 10. So if I want to convert this into an arrow function, I just get rid of the function here. I add an arrow and I just get rid of the returned also. So it gets me into a one line statement and looks simple and sweet. Let me run this. It gives me the value as 40. How to sort the array? So let me change the array. So I can just say sort here. Let me run this. So it gives me an ascending order 2, 8, 10 and 19. If you want it in descending, gives me in a descending order, that is 19, 10, 8 and 2. How to self invoke an arrow function? Let's see self invoking array function. So this alerts me hello world. So I've just added the arrow function inside the parenthesis and calling it just like a normal function would have been. So it looks like this. So this is the arrow function. So this is the self invoking. Now let's take a look at this keyword and how let's compare it with the old traditional way and how set timeout benefits here. So what I am trying to do in this here is I am setting the counter as 0 and I want to increment this counter in the set interval after every 1 second. Let me just console the counter first. And also write it to the HTML, to the div which I have already defined. So I've written my function. So I've used, this is my set interval. I have 3 statements in that. I'm consoling first my this dot counter. I'm incrementing the counter and assigning the value to the div. So it's getting incremented after every 1 second. Let's run this. Sorry, I missed the new keyword here. So I'm getting the value as none here. So if I check in console, this third counter gives me undefined first and then none. So why is that? So this set interval, it's having a function here. This function has its own these keywords. So when it tries to get from this, it doesn't find locally the counter variable. So what can we do over here is to refer to the counter variable, we'll first have to store this variable in another variable. So we are using that for this. So in that is storing the value of this. The scope of this is stored in the variable that. So now when we assign that dot counter, we'll see how it works. Now we are getting the value and it's getting incremented after 1 second. So this is the additional stuff that we have to do when we are using a normal function. This keyword is not shared internally because each function has its own this assigned to it. Now let's take a look at how arrow function would have helped. So I'm removing the function keyword, putting an arrow, and I'm just using this as it is. So I can get rid of this now. So when I try to increment, so it's working the way just I wanted. I don't have to store an additional this keyword in another variable. I can use just directly the this inside the set interval. So here is how arrow function is helping us out. Now let's take a look at how to use object return in an arrow function. There's one thing to note, you cannot just return an object return in an arrow function. So what happens then? So let's take a look. So when I run this, I get the value as undefined. It doesn't return me the edge. Why? Because arrow function doesn't understand this as an object return. It thinks that it's a statement of the code and it doesn't know what to do with it. So whenever you're using an object return inside an arrow function, make sure it is enclosed in the parenthesis. Now when you run this, just going to work the way you want. It gives you the object back. Now let's try to use arrow function as a constructor and see what happens. So when we run this, it gives an error saying display message is not a constructor. So it's not recommended to use an arrow function for a constructor. JavaScript throws an error for the same and it will not work properly. So think about it of how arrow function can benefit you. Now take a look at one more example, like button. Now let's just add an event to this button. So btn is equal to document So if I console this over here, so let me click on the button. So this refers to the window, not to the btn. So if I want to do something like btn dot inner html as change the so what I'm trying to do is, on click of the button, I'm trying to change the value, that is from click me to change the name. So sorry, I'll just put change. So when I run this and I try to click me, nothing so I'm trying to use btn.html, so it's changing. I run this. So if I click me, so but if I try to use this and try to use click me, nothing will happen because this refers to a window and not to the btn. But if I had to use a normal function, then it would have worked for me just the way I wanted it. So think on arrow function where you can make a proper use of it and utilize it. That's all for now. Thank you.